Hi, it's Dennis Daly. Shortly after the attacks on 9/11, I got really angry, and I started putting together some thoughts based upon my knowledge of American history, and one point came back over and over again: the importance of America in the fact that it is based on a sheet of paper, not the will of a dictator or the power of an army, but the Constitution. And maybe when those terrorists attacked, they just didn't understand that. So I thought I would replay what happened when I finished that speech. I called it "Why People Hate America." I was later told it should be better named "Why People Love America."
There has been a lot of talk since September 11th about the number of people who hate America. Well, I guess some people do. It must have taken a powerful lot of hate for those terrorists to have done what they did that terrible day. But I like to think that for everyone who hates this country, there are an awful lot of other people who just don't understand us. And for some of them, it's excusable. You see, if you live in a third world country or under the thumb of a dictator, or in any nation that belongs to the government of the month club, you cannot understand how this country, this America, has been able to survive using the same basic political blueprint since the late 1700s. We have evolved incredibly. We've had riots in the streets, 4 presidents assassinated, contested presidential elections, scandals in Washington. We have fought in unpopular foreign wars, and we've even seen brothers kill brothers in our own civil war. But through all of that, we have somehow managed to lead and feed the world. We've added 37 stars to our flag, and we've seen Old Glory planted on the surface of the moon, but there are still some people who do not understand. And far too many of them call themselves Americans. To really understand where we are today, to look at the America of this moment, you have to go back to when those first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. You have to go back to the Revolutionary War. We forget today that it was nearly 6 long, bloody years. Nearly 11,000 people killed, maimed, mutilated, herds and flocks scattered to the wind, homes and hamlets burned, men hanged for treason, and people on both sides just wanted it to get over. It's instructive to note that during the Revolutionary War, the ragtag, underpaid, underfed, underclothed American army under George Washington never really won that many spectacular battles. But in some ways, Washington hadn't been worried because he realized that the only way to continue to fight the awesome army and the might of the British Empire was to hit and run, and sometimes retreat, to walk away and fight another day. Finally, it did get over at Yorktown, and that might not have been an American victory had not part of the French fleet shown up at the last minute. You see, it was almost as if we had the ball and were up by 1 point and the clock ran out. So because the Revolutionary War was decisive but not dramatic, it would take us 2 years of negotiations in Paris to get a treaty signed. And whom did we send to negotiate? The original Odd Couple, acerbic, acid-tongued, loud John Adams, who maybe more than any other person in colonial times ate, breathed, and slept the cause of liberty. And a man who was the best-known citizen of the world back then. He had been an American in Paris. He came home to see if he could help Benjamin Franklin. Now, we honor Franklin's name today, but you know, John Adams thought that Benjamin Franklin was the worst possible choice. He thought that Benjamin Franklin was a womanizer, a dirty old man. And he said, you know, the only reason Ben Franklin wants to go back to Paris is to party, not to negotiate. And worse than that, Adams would later write that Ben Franklin was, in his words, an apologist. He said that every time he, John Adams, made an important point in the negotiations with the British, Ben Franklin would stand up and say, now let's talk about this. But that bad guy, good guy image prevailed, and the American cause succeeded. But while we were trying to win our freedom in Paris, we almost lost it here at home. You see, George Washington had moved his still underpaid, underfed, underclothed army to an encampment on the Hudson River called Newburgh, which is today about an hour north of New York City. The day he arrived, one of his aides told him that most of his top aides were going to leave. They were willing to settle for half a loaf of liberty in return for just being home. And you know, George Washington didn't blame them. He did not want to be there either. But Washington realized something that most of his aides didn't realize, that if the army fell apart, and word of that got back to Paris, then Adams and Franklin and John Jay, who had joined them, could not negotiate from a position of strength. He was unwilling to let the fruits of liberty die on the vine so close to final harvest. And because of this, and many of you may know, George Washington every day wrote to members of the Continental Congress begging them not to renege on their promise to reward the heroes of the Revolution, but it was mostly for nothing. Finally, one day, his aide-de-camp came to him and said, General Washington, half your army is about to mutiny if they're not paid. Thank God, and ironically, that same day he got a letter from a member of the Continental Congress. It didn't say very much. It basically said, hang in there. When the treaty is signed, everybody will be paid. So armed with that letter and nothing else but the strength of his magnificent personality, George Washington immediately called a meeting for that night of all of his aides in a long wooden building called the Temple of Virtue, which was the chapel at Newburgh. Historians tell us that George Washington walked in very quietly with a very glum look on his face. You see, Washington didn't like public speaking. It's absolutely true that he had rotten teeth. As a matter of fact, he'd gotten down to having only one left. You look at any painting of Washington or the dollar bill, and you'll see that he always looks kind of dour. So he walked to the front, he turned around, and he quietly reminded his men of the precious nature of freedom and the need for increased patience. Then he took that letter from his pocket and he held it up to read it, but he found that he couldn't read it. Not that the light was bad, but you see, George Washington's eyesight had failed. And so from his pocket he took a little pair of glasses and he put them on, and there was a gasp in the room. See, we think nothing today about wearing glasses, but in Washington's time, for a man that important to wear glasses in public was a symbol of weakness. And he spoke to his troops. You who have been with me through the long prosecution of this war have watched me grow old and gray. But now I find I am nearly blind. He read the letter with great difficulty, put it and his glasses back into his pocket, and walked out. Didn't say another word. Now, historians don't really say much about what was in that letter, but every historian tells us that every man in that room who kept a diary or a ledger would write in it that night that when George Washington left the temple, the seasoned, battle-hardened soldiers there wept. For they had seen their father figure. They had seen a man who led them to victory, a man who pleaded their case before the Continental Congress, a wealthy Virginia plantation owner who froze and starved with them at Valley Forge, humbled himself in their eyes in the cause of freedom. And they somehow knew that if George Washington were vulnerable and fragile and frail, so vulnerable and fragile and frail was freedom. And something else the historians tell us is that after that night, There was never again a call for mutiny. So the Army stayed together. The British signed on the dotted line. The American delegation came home. The soldiers got paid. But then for 3 long, excruciating years, the indecisive Continental Congress sat in low gear, squandering our hard-fought freedoms, doing absolutely nothing. Finally, a group of progressive delegates convinced the leadership that if America were ever going to move forward, if she were ever going to be a separate nation, if the dreams of the patriots were to be fulfilled, something had to happen now, because the window of opportunity was about to close. So 100 delegates were chosen to meet behind closed doors in the heat of a Philadelphia summer without the benefit of air conditioning or right guard. And when they gathered that first night, they asked themselves this daunting question: what in God's name do we do now? For they had been given no less a task than the creation of a new nation. And we forget today, these hundreds of years later, that these young men, these wild-eyed radicals, could have done anything they wanted. And if they had asked the wrong questions or made the wrong decisions, we would have to deal with the consequences of their mistakes today. But they didn't. They did the right thing. They looked at all of the nations that had flourished and failed, and they asked themselves, what went wrong? They looked at great revolutions of the past, and it suddenly occurred to them that nearly all of them had, after the final battle, somehow self-destructed. And they realized that the euphoria that comes with victory must be channeled and focused, or it will be lost. They looked, of course, at the Magna Carta, that great charter, but they realized that it had been forced on King John by a bunch of wealthy land-owning barons who were only concerned about the rights of the royalty, and the common man be damned. For up until that point in history, the definition of governmental power was that it rested at the top, usually in the hands of one man or one woman, and it trickled down slowly, and more times than not, never. So what they did, these young men, many of them lawyers, one a shoemaker, what they did for us was to simply turn the world upside down. For they would write in black and white that power belongs to the people. And when it came time to design the game plan for their new American government, they used the one geometric figure that cannot collapse on itself, the triangle, with a legislative, a judicial, and an executive branch. And they gave each branch the power to spy on the other two in a system of checks and balances, and they prayed that if all three operated in harmony, something magic would happen. And when it came time to design the executive branch, they knew they had to do their best work, because it is the executive that forges America's foreign policy. It is the President of the United States who is the visual representative of this country abroad. And the more they talked, the more they debated about the texture, the persona of the American presidency, the more their eyes strayed to the front of the room, to their president of the Constitutional Convention, a man who had kept them in focus and on track all through the debate, a tall, quiet man with rotten teeth and failing eyesight. You see, our American government, our executive branch, was actually patterned after George Washington. And so when you hear that George Washington is the father of our country, it will probably mean more to you than before. They wanted to know how they had done. Each delegate rose in turn and gave his assessment. The last one to rise was an old guy who had slept through most of the deliberations, Ben Franklin. Could we have done better? Likely. Could we have done worse? Very likely. Is it perfect? No. Franklin reminded his friends, in his words, that nothing is perfect and that even the sun has spots. And when it came time to sign, these delegates did something you and I might not have done. For if we had written the Constitution, we probably would have put "we the undersigned." But they had taken care of that on day one, page one, line one, when they wrote "we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union." And when they signed not only for themselves, but for the 3 million Americans alive at that time, and they made it abundantly clear that they were signing for their posterity. And my friends, if you look around this room, you will see what that posterity looks like. Because before we were born, before our parents or our grandparents were born, our names, their names were on that document, and the names of every man and woman yet to be born in this country are there. For the Constitution is a sacred contract signed in the past for us that is valid at this moment, that is taking us into tomorrow. So they made copies and they sent it out and they waited. And people read it and they loved it. Because for the first time, average men and women had been told that they had rights, that they had dignity. And not that that dignity had been given them as a present by those men in Philadelphia. Those men in Philadelphia simply informed them in writing that they had had it all along. But the more they read it, they asked questions. They'd been given this great big fuzzy bucket of liberty, and too much liberty can be too much freedom. They asked themselves questions such as, if there's another war, can the Army house troops in my home? If I get on a street corner 20 years from now and tell the world I don't like the president, will I be arrested? If I am arrested, will they tell me why? Will I have a lawyer? Will I have a jury trial? Will I have to testify against myself? And maybe more importantly, among everything else, will any governmental official try to tell me how to pray? One of the great unsung heroes of the Revolution, George Mason, said, because the Constitution was amendable, then let's fix it. Let's define America's freedoms. But you know, you cannot amend a Constitution until it's ratified. So one by one, the states said yes, but they stuck a little Post-it note on their vote saying, this is okay, but, you know, let's work on this. One state wanted 6 amendments. Massachusetts wanted 30. The government got underway, and it's hard to believe today that on day one, all 3 branches of our federal government were in one little building in New York City, Federal Hall. But when you're starting a new government, the last thing on your mind is to amend your Constitution. So they waited 3 years. Finally, on the floor of the House of Representatives, 10 amendments were crafted. And George Mason had wanted the debate to be in public. He said, not behind closed doors as it was in Philadelphia. Well, the debate was public this time. And if you don't think the spirit of Philadelphia was with those men who eventually met in New York, listen to the 10th Amendment. Any power not used by the federal government or earmarked for use by the states remains the property of the people. So they made copies, they sent it out, they held their breath, they waited, and people really liked it. One by one, the states said yes, and ironically, the last state to ratify, to make it official, was the state of George Washington, of George Mason, of Thomas Jefferson. December 15th, 1791, with the yes vote of Virginia, the Bill of Rights became law, and our freedoms as we know them today were born. Now, I like to think something very special was with those men in Philadelphia and New York. Call it fate, the hand of God, divine providence, whatever, because what they crafted was so new, so revolutionary, and it has been so lasting and so copied by other governments. Now, if you're still not sure America is a special place, listen to some of the coincidences surrounding the Founding Fathers. Some of you may know this, but on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams lay dying. His last thought was that America should be left in good hands. And as he died, John Adams said, at least Thomas Jefferson survives. What he had no way of knowing in the days before CNN and the telephone is that 90 minutes before, Thomas Jefferson had died. Both of them, 50th anniversary, nearly at the anniversary moment that the Declaration of Independence was published. On the 55th anniversary, our fifth president, James Monroe, died. And just days before the 60th anniversary, James Madison took ill. Little James Madison. I say that not derisively. He was 5'4", shortest man to ever be president, but he was a giant in his time. He advocated a complete separation of church and state, said that every American child should have a good education, and that slavery should be abolished. And in his last public speech, he said, quote, "If freedom is to be lasting forever, it must be cherished and nurtured." Of course, Madison didn't want to die. His family didn't want him to. But on the 28th of June, 1836, James Madison died. A courier rushed the word to the White House. Andrew Jackson was president, and he received the word as if he had been hit by a ton of bricks. You see, up until that point, if Jackson had had any question about the Constitution, about the extent of the freedom of speech or the right to bear arms, he could have called in James Madison, whom we now call the father of the Constitution. But you see, with the death of James Madison, the last founding father died. The last link to the past was gone. Andy Jackson thought up until that moment the ship of state had always sailed within sight of land, but now he must take it into uncharted waters. But not really. You see, Jackson had that chart. We have that chart. And if we would be permitted to reach behind the protective glass of the National Archives and retrieve the Constitution, we could hold in our hands America's freedom, not because of the might of an army or the will of a dictator or the personality of a potentate, but because of simple English words in now fading ink on now crumbling parchment. And that is what people don't understand about this country. You know, those terrorists did some horrible things that awful day, but at least they didn't take down the Statue of Liberty. And as long as that woman is holding her torch, the welcome mat is out, the vacancy lamp is lit. There are people who say that illegal immigration is the great evil. Well, it is a serious problem. But many people who feel strongly that way don't realize that it was the influx of men and women from every corner of the globe that brought about the complex interwoven patchwork quilt that is the texture and strength of America. That when the Declaration of Independence was signed, many of the signers were, in our words, illegal immigrants. But they had come to this country, saw what freedom was, liked the taste of it, and were willing to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to preserve it. America is not an elevator that once you get in, you want the doors to close. And if you feel that way, you have not read what is on the Statue of Liberty. Most of you can recite part of it. Give me, you're tired, you're poor. That's the third verse. A woman named Emma Lazarus saw the statue. There was a fundraising drive to finish paying for the pedestal. The French had given us the statue, but a 151-foot-tall statue needs a very large pedestal. School kids from around America sent in pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters. Emma Lazarus sent in a poem. She contrasted the Statue of Liberty standing there in the harbor to another statue at another time for another purpose, to keep people out. And that was the Colossus of Rhodes. She called her poem The New Colossus. Listen to the words. They're so carefully chosen and so electric. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning. Her name, Mother of Exiles. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, she cries with silent lips. Give me, your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. It may not be so much that people don't understand us. It may be that they're just jealous. God bless us, God bless America, and thank you very much.
It's hard to believe it was 20 years ago that those terrorists struck the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and tried for God knows what. Looking back, I'm glad I gave that speech. I'm glad I wrote it, because I really believe the fact that we are a great nation because of some simple, very simple words. I'm Dennis Daly.